The town sat quietly under the New Mexico sun, a small cluster of wooden houses surrounded by wide-open land. The days were hot, and the nights turned cold enough to make a man thankful for a single candle flame. People came and went, soldiers, traders, ranchers. But no one paid attention to the quiet woman who sat near the stables behind the fort. She was called the last Apache woman, though no one knew her real name. Some said she had no family left. Others said she had once lived near the river and watched everyone she knew disappear one by one. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, and she rarely spoke. When the soldiers asked her to help with chores, she did it without complaint. She swept the floors, carried water, and stayed away from trouble. No one hurt her, but no one helped her either. To them, she was a reminder of old battles and old fears, a story they wished to forget. Yet there she was, sitting by the stable every evening, staring at the horizon as if she was waiting for someone who never came. Among those who passed the fort was a farmer named Eli Turner. He lived a few miles outside the town, alone on a piece of dry land that he had worked for years. Eli had once been a happy man with a wife named Clara and dreams of growing apple trees along the creek. But Clara had fallen sick one winter, and by the time spring returned, she was gone. Eli never married again. He spoke little, worked hard, and kept to himself. The townspeople respected him for his honesty, but pitied him for his loneliness. One morning, Eli brought a wagon full of grain to sell at the town market. He stood beside his wagon, talking with a trader, when he overheard two soldiers laughing near the well. One said, "They still have that Apache woman out back. Nobody wants her. The command is tired of feeding her." The other replied, "They'll probably send her away next month. Maybe to a work camp. That's better than letting her wander off." Their words made Eli stop what he was doing. He did not know why, but he felt a sudden heaviness in his chest. He had seen the woman before, once or twice, carrying a bucket or sitting near the fence. There had been something in her eyes, a quiet strength that he could not forget. That evening, Eli couldn't sleep. The sound of wind moving through the dry grass kept him awake. He thought about how lonely his home had become, and how unfair it was for anyone to be left with no place to go. The next morning, he rode back into town and went straight to the fort. The officer in charge looked surprised to see him. "What brings you here, Mr. Turner?" the officer asked. Eli hesitated for a moment, then said, "I want to know what will happen to the Apache woman." The officer shrugged. "She's under government control. Nobody's claimed her. We'll likely transfer her east for labor service." Eli nodded slowly. "And if someone wanted to take responsibility for her?" The officer raised an eyebrow. "You mean you want to take her?" "I mean, I want her to be free," Eli said quietly. "I'll sign whatever paper you need." The officer gave a short laugh. "That's not how things work. You'd need to pay her release fee. Not much by government standards, but more than a farmer's comfort." Eli reached into his coat and pulled out a small bag of coins, his savings from selling crops enough to keep him through winter. "Will this do?" The officer opened the bag, looked inside, and let out a low whistle. "You really mean this?" Eli met his eyes. "I do. No one should live like a prisoner when the war is over." By the next morning, the papers were signed. The officer told the guards to let the woman go. She came out slowly, carrying a small blanket, her dark hair tangled, her feet bare. The sun was still rising behind her, and for a moment Eli saw how thin she was, how tired, yet her posture remained straight, proud. He offered her a piece of bread and said softly, "You're free to go. But if you've nowhere to go, you can come with me. I have land, and you'll have a roof." She looked at him for a long time without answering. Then she nodded once and followed him to his wagon. The road back to his farm was quiet. She did not speak, and Eli did not press her. The only sounds were the wheels rolling over stones and the wind brushing across the fields. When they reached his farm, Eli showed her the small house and the barn beside it. "You can rest here," he said. "There's water by the well. I'll bring food." She stood at the doorway, still holding the blanket, her eyes moving across the wide-open sky. Eli thought she might leave that night, but she didn't. In the following days, she began helping with small things, fetching water, mending torn cloth, feeding the chickens. Eli noticed that she worked with quiet care. She never wasted anything and always finished what she started. When he thanked her, she only nodded. Her silence didn't bother him. After years of loneliness, having another person around, even a silent one, felt like sunlight after a long winter. Sometimes in the evenings, he would find her sitting outside watching the horizon. The sunsets in New Mexico were long and wide, the sky burning golden red before fading to purple. One evening, Eli carried 2 mugs of warm tea and sat beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. Then she asked in a soft voice, "Why did you pay for me?" Eli looked at the fading light. Because no one else would, and because no one should have to stay behind bars for being who they are. She lowered her eyes. "You didn't have to." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I wanted to." From that day, a quiet understanding grew between them. They worked side by side without words, he plowing the field, she repairing fences or washing clothes. When storms rolled in, they covered the animals together and waited it out near the fireplace. Eli began to realize how much peace her presence brought to the farm. The house no longer felt empty. One evening, after a long day of fixing the roof, Eli found her near the barn, watching a small bird drink from a trough. The orange glow of sunset touched her face. She turned to him and said, "You didn't buy me. You freed me." He looked at her, then at the open sky behind her. "That's all I wanted." For the first time, she smiled, a faint, careful smile that seemed to warm the air around them. In that small moment, Eli felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not pity, something quieter and deeper. He felt alive again. As the weeks went on, the neighbors began to notice that the lonely farmer no longer sat alone at the market. They saw him walking beside the woman with the dark braids and calm eyes. Some whispered, some frowned, but Eli didn't care. He had lived long enough to know that kindness mattered more than gossip. On one cool evening, as the stars began to appear, he built a small fire outside. She sat beside him, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. For the first time, she told him her name. "Tala," she said. "It means wolf." Eli nodded. "That suits you." She tilted her head slightly. "Why?" "Because you survived alone. You stayed strong." Her eyes softened. "And you?" she asked quietly. He smiled. "Maybe I'm just a farmer who didn't want to be alone anymore." They sat together for a long while, the fire crackling between them. Neither spoke again that night. But something unspoken had changed, the kind of change that doesn't need words, only the silence of 2 hearts learning to trust again. The winter came early that year, with cold winds sweeping across the open plains. Eli Turner's farm, once filled with golden fields, now lay quiet under a thin layer of frost. The days were shorter, the nights long and silent. Inside the small farmhouse, a fire burned each evening, and 2 figures sat beside it, the lonely farmer and the woman he had freed. Tala had been with him for many months now. She still spoke little, but the quiet between them had grown warm and easy, like 2 old songs that fit together without effort. Eli had become used to her way of moving through the house. She rose early before the first light, fed the chickens and gathered wood before the frost melted. She never waited for him to ask for help. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it. When Eli offered thanks, she would nod with a small smile, her eyes bright even in the dim light. Though she said little, her presence filled the home in a way that words never could. The townspeople began to talk. Some said the farmer had lost his mind, taking in a woman from the old tribes. Others said he was a kind man, maybe too kind for this world. But Eli didn't pay attention. For the first time in years, he didn't care what others thought. He felt peace when he came home and saw Tala sitting by the fire, her hands busy with sewing or carving small patterns into wood. One afternoon, as Eli worked in the barn, he noticed her standing by the fence, watching a storm form far off in the distance. The clouds rolled heavy and gray, moving like waves across the sky. He walked up beside her and said quietly, It'll be a hard winter. She nodded but didn't look afraid. Instead, she said, then we'll keep the fire strong. Eli looked at her, surprised by how natural her words sounded in his home. The storm came that night. Wind rattled the windows and the roof groaned under the force of it. Eli checked the barn to make sure the animals were safe, but the cold bit deep into his chest. By morning he felt weak, his throat burning and his hands shaking. Tala found him coughing near the kitchen table, his face pale. Without hesitation, she helped him back to bed. She stayed beside him through the long hours, feeding him warm broth and wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. For days, Eli drifted between sleep and waking. Through the haze, he saw her sitting by his side, her eyes full of worry yet steady with care. She barely slept. When the fire burned low, she gathered more wood. When his fever rose, she whispered quietly, "You will get well." And though her voice was soft, there was something in it that gave him strength. When Eli finally woke to find the fever gone, sunlight was streaming through the window. He turned his head and saw her asleep in a chair, still holding his coat in her lap. Her hair was messy, her face tired, but there was peace in the way she slept. Eli smiled faintly, realizing she hadn't left his side once. He tried to sit up quietly, not to wake her, but the creak of the bed made her open her eyes. "You should rest," she said softly. "I've rested enough," he answered. "You've done more work than both of us put together." She shook her head. The farm needed care. Someone had to keep it alive. He looked around the room. Everything was neat, the floors swept, the firewood stacked by the wall. Outside, he could hear the faint sounds of chickens and the creak of the barn door. She had done all this alone. Eli felt a deep wave of gratitude rise inside him. Later that evening, when they sat near the fire, he spoke again. "You could have left any time. No one would have stopped you." Tala looked into the flames before answering. "And go where?" she asked. "There's no place for me out there. The world has its doors closed for people like me." Eli thought about that for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Then maybe we open one ourselves." She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable at first. Then she gave a small nod. "A place where both of us belong." As the days passed, Eli regained his strength. He began working again, but now he wasn't alone. Tala worked beside him every step of the way. They repaired the broken fences together, planted small winter crops, and cared for the animals. Sometimes they didn't speak for hours, yet the silence was peaceful, filled with quiet understanding. Spring returned slowly, bringing back color to the land. Flowers began to grow along the edge of the fields, and the air turned warm again. Neighbors who had once kept their distance started visiting, curious to see how the farmer and the Apache woman were living. They found the house clean, the fields blooming, and two people working side by side with calm and respect. At first, people still whispered, but whispers faded with time. Tala's kindness won them over. She helped anyone who came by, mending torn clothes, sharing food, and tending to sick animals. Soon the townsfolk began greeting her when she passed, and even the children waved when she rode into town with Eli. The woman they once called the last Apache became part of their world quietly, without asking for it. One evening, Eli sat outside watching the sunset. The sky stretched wide and golden, and the air smelled of rain. Tala joined him, setting down 2 cups of tea. They sat together, looking at the horizon where the sky touched the earth. After a long silence, Eli said, "I used to think my life ended when my wife passed, but now I see it didn't end, it just waited for you to walk into it." Tala didn't speak for a moment. Then she said softly, "When you freed me, I thought I would leave as soon as I could. But I stayed because this land began to feel like home, and you treated me as someone worth saving." Eli turned to her, his voice low. "You were never someone who needed saving. You just needed someone to believe you belonged." She smiled gently, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "And you did." As the years passed, their farm became known as a peaceful place where anyone could find kindness and shelter. Travelers would stop by for water and rest, and Eli and Tala would welcome them with food and stories. People from nearby towns spoke of the farmer who once freed a forgotten woman, and how together they built a life filled with quiet dignity. When Eli grew older and could no longer work the fields, Tala took care of everything. She would still wake before sunrise, feed the animals, and tend to the garden. And every evening she would sit beside him by the fire, just as she had from the beginning. Sometimes he would look at her and say, "You know, people think I saved you." She would smile, her voice calm and sure. "But we both know the truth. You gave me freedom and I gave you reason." Years later, when travelers passed through the valley, they would see a small house covered in vines and flowers. They would ask, "Who lives there?" The locals would tell them about Eli Turner, the farmer who once paid for a woman's freedom, and about Tala, the woman who turned his lonely farm into a home filled with light. The story became a quiet legend in the town, a story not of wealth or war, but of kindness, respect, and two hearts that found peace in each other's company. And long after both of them were gone, the fields they once worked together stayed green, as if the land itself remembered them. The wind that moved through the grass seemed to whisper their names, carrying the memory of the man who gave freedom and the woman who gave love without ever needing to say it aloud. Their story was not written in books or carved on stone, but it lived in the hearts of those who passed by, reminding everyone that even in a world full of noise and distance, two souls could still find each other and build something gentle that would never fade.